Before I officially begin the video, I wanted to place this content warning for antisemitism, white supremacy, and racism. I urge you to consult with your own caution before continuing this video. Thank you. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Zillennial Falcon Show. It's going to be 3 weeks since Marvel Studios dropped another banger with Spider-Man Brand New Day. And so what better time to take the opportunity to discuss Marvel's very own New York native and American pop culture icon donning a red and blue costume, Captain America. You've read the thumbnail. I'm going to be talking about Captain America. So for this episode, we'll be continuing our countdown to Doomsday with Captain America: The First Avenger, directed by Joe Johnston and released in July of 2011, starring Chris Evans, Haley Atwell, Hugo Weaving, Sebastian Stan, and Tommy Lee Jones. It was the fifth ever full-length feature film released by Marvel Studios, part of their Phase 1 lineup and second to last entry before it culminated with The Avengers in 2012. The character had been previously adapted in a black and white serial film by Republic Pictures in 1944, 2 TV films made for CBS in the 70s, and 1 direct-to-video film in 1990 by Canon, along with making cameo appearances throughout various cartoon adaptations of other Marvel characters like Spider-Man and the X-Men. Now I gotta be absolutely honest with y'all. I didn't even bother seeing this in the movie theaters. Even without getting political, I always thought the whole hoorah military stuff like G.I. Joe and shit was hella corny. And as a filthy casual zillennial, I didn't know shit about Captain America until I was blessed with a copy of Marvel Ultimate Alliance for the PlayStation 2, where I got to learn about the lore of characters I wasn't as familiar with. So when I saw that his backstory was rooted in a retro World War II pastiche type beat, I felt like I knew everything I needed to about the character. And boy was I wrong. The truth be told, part of what took so long for this video to come out was that I realized that the appropriate scope for this specific video extended way beyond simply reviewing a superhero movie. Before I can even begin to crack open the source material which inspired the movie, I have to do this subject justice and ensure that I provide a sufficient amount of context preceding my review of this film. In the opening paragraph to the introduction of his book Hitler's American Model, James Q. Whitman wrote, on June 5th, 1934, about a year and a half after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of the Reich, the leading lawyers of Nazi Germany gathered at a meeting to plan what would become the Nuremberg Laws, the notorious anti-Jewish legislation of the Nazi regime. The meeting was chaired by Franz Gerler, the Reich Minister of Justice, and attended by officials who in the coming years would play central roles in the persecution of Germany's Jews. Among those present was Bernhard Lozener, one of the principal draftsmen of the Nuremberg Laws, and the terrifying Roland Freisler, later president of the Nazis' People Court, and a man whose name has endured as a byword for 20th century judicial savagery. The meeting was an important one, and a stenographer was present to record a verbatim transcript, to be preserved by the ever-diligent Nazi bureaucracy as a record of a crucial moment in the creation of the new race regime. The meeting involved detailed and lengthy discussions of the law of the United States. In the opening minutes, Justice Minister Gerder presented a memo on American race law, which had been carefully prepared by the officials of the ministry for the purposes of the gathering, and the participants returned repeatedly to the American models of racist legislation in the course of their discussions. It is particularly startling to discover that the most radical Nazis present were the most ardent champions of the lessons that American approaches held for Germany. Nor is this transcript the only record of Nazi engagement with American law. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, many Nazis, including not least Hitler himself, took a serious interest in the racist legislation of the United States. Indeed, in Mein Kampf, Hitler praised America as nothing less than the one state that had made progress towards the creation of a healthy racist order of the kind the Nuremberg laws were intended to establish. Whitman concludes his book's introduction with the following passages. Influence is a complex business of translation, creative adaptation, selective borrowing, and invocation of authority. All borrowers engage in tinkering and retrofitting. That is as true of the Nazis as it is of any other regime. All borrowers start from foreign models and then reshape them to meet their own circumstances. That is true of vicious racist borrowers just as it is true of everyone else. Influence does not come just through verbatim borrowing. It comes through inspiration and example. And the United States had much inspiration and example to offer Nazi lawyers in the early 1930s, the era of the making of the Nuremberg laws. Nazism was not simply a nightmarish parenthesis in history that bore no relationship to what came before and after, nor was it a completely unexampled racist horror. The Nazis were not simply demons who erupted out of some dark underworld to shatter what was good and just within the Western tradition, until they were put down by forces of arms and the authentic and humane and progressive values of Europe were restored. There were traditions of Western government within which they worked. There were continuities between Nazis and what came before and after. There were examples and inspirations on which the Nazis drew, and American race law was prominent among them. In his book, Whitman goes on to elaborate further on the various figures involved in the making of the Nuremberg laws and their literary works, such as Volkisch World History by Albert Wirth, The Supremacy of the White Race by Warhold Drascher, Handbook of the Jewish Question by Theodor Fritsch, Race Law in the United States by Heinrich Krieger, and even Adolf Hitler's infamous Mein Kampf. In tracking the Nazi strain in the European engagement with American race law, the place to begin is with the movement's Bible, Hitler's Mein Kampf, which includes the quote, "The racially pure and still unmixed German has risen to become master of the American continent, and he will remain the master as long as he does not fall victim to racial pollution." The second volume of Mein Kampf, published in 1927, laid out Hitler's vision for German renewal. That vision drew broadly on the Nazi Party program of 1920. 5 of his 25 points involved citizenship. The 1920 Party program called for sharp limits on citizenship, which was to be restricted to persons of German blood, along with a scheme of disabilities for resident foreigners who were to be threatened with expulsion. In Volume 2 of Mein Kampf, Hitler built on the 1920 Party program, developing a more elaborate conception of race-based citizenship. But as he turned to the citizenship problem in 1927, Hitler was able to seize on the source of authority that had not been available in 1920, in the form of the new American immigration statutes of 1921 and 1924. After demanding the acquisition of citizenship take a more meaningful and elevated race-based form, Hitler then turned to the only example on the international scene of a praiseworthy order. There is currently one state in which one can observe at least weak beginnings of a better conception. This is of course not our exemplary German Republic, but the American Union, in which an effort is being made to consider the dictates of reason to at least some extent. The American Union categorically refuses the immigration of physically unhealthy elements, and simply excludes the immigration of certain races. In these respects, America already pays obeisance, at least in tentative steps, to the characteristic folkish conception of the state. The views of the Führer on the subject of the race state, it goes without saying, carried immense weight in Nazi Germany. Hitler's discussion of American immigration law and Mein Kampf in particular would be cited whenever Nazi jurists discussed problems with citizenship after the Nazis took the reins in 1933, and it set the tone that remained dominant in Nazi writings on American law throughout the early 30s. America was a country that was in some ways weak, and its future as a racist order was perhaps uncertain, but it remained the leading example of a jurisdiction groping its way towards a race law of the kind essential to the creation of a folkish state, most especially through its sage immigration restrictions. Albert Wirth, in his 1934 Volkisch World History, a global history for Nazi readers, with a stock portrait of Hitler as its frontispiece, described America for his German readers in these terms in his opening pages. The most important event in the history of the state of the second millennium, up until the First World War, was the founding of the United States of America. The struggle of the Aryans for world domination received thereby its strongest prop. And according to Warhol Drasher, the founding was the first fateful turning point in the worldwide rise of white supremacy. America had assumed the leadership of the white peoples after World War I, fulfilling the promise of centuries of American racism. And if it were not for the contribution of the Americans, a conscious unity of the white race would never have emerged. Theodor Fritsch was the man responsible for publishing the German editions of both the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and the anti-Semitic writings of Henry Ford. This figure, one of the guiding lights of German antisemitism, featured the United States in the opening pages of his handbook, which would be reprinted over and over again in the Nazi period. Late 19th century America was a country, wrote Fritsch, that had finally learned the error of its egalitarian ways. America, soaked in ideas of freedom and equality, has hitherto accorded equal rights to all races, but it finds itself compelled to revise its attitudes and its laws and create restrictions on Negroes and Chinese. To Fritz, the history of American immigration law offered a parable on the dangers of ignoring race in favor of a foolish egalitarianism. The forms of discriminatory legal and systemic practices conducted by the U.S. government that the Nazi Party examined for inspiration include the Naturalization Act of 1790, the post-Spanish American War insular cases of 1901, the Asiatic Barred Zone Act of 1917, the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, and the Immigration Act of 1924. The Nazis also looked at the second-class citizenship of Black Americans, particularly how even after the conclusion of the Civil War and the overturning of Dred Scott versus Stanford, Black American voting rights were deliberately limited through literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, which limited voting rights to those whose ancestors had voted before emancipation, and more. As the National Socialist Monthly put it in November of 1933, echoing Mein Kampf and Frisch's Handbook of the Jewish Question, the United States of the New World have come to understand the monstrous danger of the great melting pot of races over the course of the last decades, and put a check on bastardization through draconian immigration law. To these circles of tribally related Americans, we reach out our hand in friendship. If you're interested in learning more about the history surrounding the process the Nazi Party underwent in drawing inspiration from U.S. legal policy, I cannot recommend enough James Q. Whitman's Hitler's American Model. But for the sake of staying on track with this video, we'll be moving on to discussing another book, Hitler's American Friends by Bradley Hart, where he examines pro-Nazi, anti-Semitic, and anti-interventionist positions, such as those held by the German-American Bund. The 1937 4th of July celebration in Yaphank, Long Island, had many elements of a typical Independence Day gala. It was a warm day, and families sat at picnic tables under the leafy trees, while the adults swigged beer and sang traditional songs. As the day wore on and the alcohol took effect, there was dancing and more carousing before a fireworks display concluded the evening. Yet this was far from a typical patriotic celebration of American history. Many of the thousands in attendance were in uniform, but not the olive green uniform of the U.S. Army. There were speeches by local dignitaries, but these were focused less on a celebration of the Declaration of Independence than a series of homages to prominent foreign leaders. Heil Hitler and Heil Mussolini were the standard greetings of the day. A huge swastika adorned the stage, which one speaker told the crowd represented Aryan groups in all countries, including the United States. More than 300 men in silver-gray shirts with black ties and Sam Brown belts that passed over their right shoulders, and others in black shirts, goose-stepped past the stage and saluted their leaders with extended right arms. These stormtroopers are not a military organization, the crowd was assured by one of the afternoon's keynote speakers. He continued by predicting dark days ahead. It would be ridiculous to believe they are drilling to take over America. Trouble is coming to America soon. and these men will be ready to fight for real American ideals against the homeless, godless minority that is seeking to take us away from true Americanism. This group was the German American Bund, and its leader was Fritz Julius Kuhn. Kuhn's background was typical for those who were attracted to the German American far right of the 1930s. Born in Munich in 1896, Kuhn served in the First World War as a machine gunner and won the Iron Cross. After the war, he joined a right-wing militia and brawled with communists on the street of Munich. In 1921, he joined the National Socialist Party and enrolled at the University of Munich to study chemical engineering. In 1923, he left Germany to take a job in Mexico. He would later claim to have been present for the beer hall putsch and said he was forced to flee in its aftermath to avoid criminal charges. But there is no evidence that this was actually the case. More likely, Kuhn moved for the same economic reasons that compelled many young men to leave Germany in the 1920s, when the country was in financial turmoil. Kuhn moved to the United States at the age of 31 and settled in the Detroit area, putting him at the hotbed of pro-Nazi sentiment in the United States. One of his first employers included the Ford Motor Company, from which he was reportedly fired for practicing speeches on company time. After Kuhn became nationally notorious, Ford officials denied any long-term connection to him and allegedly changed his employee card to suggest that he had quit at an earlier date. From there, he worked a variety of jobs while gradually pursuing his political career. Kuhn had not rushed to join the Teutonia organization after arriving in Detroit, but perhaps inspired by Hitler's recent rise to power, he joined Friends of the New Germany in mid-1933. His past experience in the Nazi Party and fanatical loyalty to Hitler ensured a swift rise, along with his powerful oratorical skills, at least when speaking German, and organizational prowess. By 1935, he had risen to the position of Midwestern district leader in the organization, simultaneously embracing his new American identity. At least on paper, he was naturalized as an American citizen in 1934. Kuhn's personal appearance and speaking style would become the source of much mockery in the years to come. He spoke English with a thick German accent and tried to imitate Hitler's erratic hand gestures and passionate body language when addressing a crowd. Lacking the Fuhrer's charisma, he merely looked ridiculous and tripped over his English words. On the other hand, it is possible to detect some of the appeal that charmed many in the Bund. He was 5 feet 11 inches tall and weighed more than 200 pounds, making him an easy figure to spot on stage. He wore glasses, giving him a somewhat scholarly appearance similar to that of SS head Heinrich Himmler. His military background gave him the gait of a warrior. He was often photographed in Bund uniform, wearing his Iron Cross and military decorations, consciously evoking the humiliation that many German Americans felt the fatherland had suffered at the end of World War I. Despite his rather bumbling image as a public orator to non-German speaking Americans, Kuhn managed to cut a larger-than-life playboy profile in the press. He was often seen at New York City nightclubs listening to jazz with the progression of beautiful mistresses, including a former Miss America. Like many demagogues throughout history, Kuhn realized that his image as a glamorous celebrity was just as important, if not more so, than his image as the punitive American Führer. Most dangerously, Kuhn would soon try to combine this memorable persona with the new ideological concoction of Nazism and loyalty to the United States. Bund rallies would see the American flag carried side by side with the new German national flag bearing the swastika. All the standard imagery of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, goose-stepping troops in jackboots, straight-arm salutes, and swastikas, were now being associated with the symbols of the United States and Americanism itself. The Bund slogan, often repeated in its proclamations and on its letterhead, was "Free America," by which it would increasingly mean an American free from Jewish influence. The Bund's most well-publicized events were similarly inundated with the language of Americanism. Its most infamous event, a 1939 mass rally at Madison Square Garden that would be steeped in violence, was officially termed a pro-American rally, with George Washington birthday exercises. A description of the event proclaimed that the Bund is opposed to all isms in American public life, including Nazism and fascism, regarding these political systems as affairs of the people who live under them, but impracticable and inexpedient innovations in the American system of government. At the same time, the Bund left little question as to what it did stand for, and it had some remarkable similarities to Nazism. The Bund opposes Zionism as an infectious disease gnawing at the core of American political, social, and economic life, covering an ever-widening field of activities which have already developed the power of American life, which cannot be shaken off as long as Jews controlled the press, the radio, the screen, and the stage. Rather than importing Nazism to the United States directly, Kuhn's entire strategy was to combine the essence of Americanism with a new and insidious version of National Socialism. Organizationally, the Bund modeled itself on the structures that underpinned its predecessors like Friends of the New Germany. Kuhn retained their armed wing of the organization, called the Ordnungsdienst, or OD, as the Bund's uniformed security force. Its members carried nightsticks and other legal weapons that could be easily used with lethal effect. OD members underwent extensive training at Bund camps and marched in formation down American streets across the country in their distinctive uniforms, giving the stiff-arm salute. This training was not just for show, and there is little doubt that its members prevented Kuhn from being harmed or even assassinated on a number of occasions when Bund events ended in violence, often precipitated by the OD itself. It is difficult to know how many men were in the OD in the course of its existence, but Kuhn estimated that it had about 5,000 uniformed members at any given time. Certainly not a huge military force, but enough trained and armed fighters to cause serious local unrest. Membership was open to all Bund men over the age of 18. The most significant organizational principle of the Bund was the Führer principle. Derived from the structure of the Nazi Party, this principle stated that the will of the Führer could never be questioned and should be seen as overriding all other considerations, including the law. In Germany, this meant that Hitler's personal whims were seen as more important than precedent, law, or the opinions of others. The Führer, by definition, could never be incorrect in his views or pronouncements, and they should therefore be followed without question. The ultimate responsibility of the Nazi Party or Bund member was to demonstrate absolute loyalty to the dictates of the leader. As will be seen, Kuhn would eventually abuse this principle to subsidize his larger-than-life image. Beneath Kuhn and his fellow national officers, the Bunds present around the country was organized into 3 regions: the East, Midwest, and West. A district leader was placed in charge of each. Nearly every major city had a local branch that reported to their respective regional center, and ultimately to Kuhn's national headquarters. By 1939, Kuhn reported that every state in the country except Louisiana had at least some measure of Bund presence, with more than 100 local units in total. These seem like impressive numbers, but actual membership figures are more difficult to pin down. In line with its ideological orientation, applying for Bund membership meant an applicant had to state they were of Aryan descent, free from Jewish or colored blood, and pay both registration fees and monthly dues, making the possible membership base small to begin with. There were also 2 levels of affiliation: full membership, which entitled the bearers to take part in all Bund activities, and sympathizer membership, which allowed the holder to attend meetings with the permission of their local unit leader only. Membership cost $9 a year, about $160 today, and was paid in monthly installments. People presumably floated between these statuses over the course of the Bund's existence, while others joined for a period and then resigned as the political situation changed. In 1939, Kuhn estimated in an internal report that there were more than 8,000 full members in the Bund, an almost impossibly low figure if there were truly 100 functional local units. He later testified that the number was closer to 20,000 with about 100,000 sympathizers. The Justice Department believed the number to be smaller than either of Kuhn's estimates, but one German government official would later outlandishly claim that Kuhn had 50,000 members at the peak of its popularity. Given how many Bund documents were later destroyed, and the fact that the membership application allowed for the use of pseudonyms, historians have barely done better determining numbers. Estimates have ranged from Kuhn's figure of 10,000 or fewer to an upper end of 30,000 or so, with many more sympathizers. Given how many local units existed at the peak of the Boone's power, it is likely that Kuhn himself did not know the true number of members and sympathizers. Extensive card catalogs of members were supposedly kept at the local level, but it is unclear how regularly local leaders reported updates to the national organization. Taking the most generous estimates of 30,000 members and around 100,000 sympathizers, in a country of 132 million people, this meant a mere 0.001% of the population was involved with the Boon. By way of comparison, Oswald Mosley's similarly unsuccessful British Union of Fascists peaked at 40,000 members and a United Kingdom population of around 46 million. Given the volume of votes for conservative members of parliament who barely concealed their admiration for Hitler, British fascist sympathizers probably ran into the hundreds of thousands in a country that was much smaller than the United States. Yet despite its seemingly limited support base, the Boon was punching well above its actual weight in the public eye. It was hardly comforting that in early 1921, a mere 12 years before taking power, the Nazi Party had just 2,000 members before exploding to 10 times that number by the end of the following year, in a country less than half the size of the United States. The Boon was arguably further along in building its membership base than the Nazis had been just a few years before Hitler became chancellor. Who was to say that under the right circumstances, Kuhn could not pull off a similar feat? The fact that membership in the Boon required one to be of Aryan background was a major restriction on its potential as a mass party, particularly given an African American population of more than 12 million, along with millions of others with European backgrounds considered to be non-Aryan, such as the Irish. Yet it was conceivable that this difficulty might be overcome if the Boon could form alliances with similarly minded groups that appealed to Americans of different ethnic backgrounds and identities. The prospect of a broad far-right front forming was not beyond the realm of possibility, especially as Kuhn had moved beyond his predecessor's obsession with spreading German propaganda at the expense of building an American version of Nazism. Indeed, there was some evidence that local Boon chapters were already seeking alliances with other far-right groups, including the Ku Klux Klan and the Silver Legion. A broad right-wing front, especially if it joined forces with Hitler's other American friends, and their money, might well be in a position to make a bid for power. Kuhn had become the first candidate for the potential position of American Führer. The Boon's aggressive use of youth camps did little to calm the growing concerns about Kuhn's intentions. The use of such camps was adopted directly from the Nazi Party's playbook. After Hitler's rise to power, German young people of both genders were regularly indoctrinated through compulsory membership in the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls, in which they were taught both Nazi ideology and war-related skills. Similarly, the Boon's Youth Division was established nationwide and held Nazi-themed summer camps in at least 15 locations around the country. Kuhn himself reported to be unclear on the actual number, mostly in the New York area, upper Midwest, and California. According to the youth division's leader, most of the parents who sent their children to Boone summer camps were German immigrants who had migrated to the country after the First World War. The Boone campers wore uniforms similar to those of the OD, including the iconic Sam Browne belts, marched in formation, learned German, and were tutored in the fundamental principles of National Socialism. As undercover reporter John C. Metcalf would testify to the Dice Committee, the main orientation of the camps was instilling the 4 H's: health, Hitler, Heils, and hatred. American boys and girls sing hymns to their Führer and to the fatherland they have never seen, Metcalf told the committee. Their youthful feet goose-step in a march of racial and religious hatred. The minds and souls of these babes in the wood are a fertile field to the propaganda of the Boon. The exact number of children who took part in the Boone summer camps remain unknown. But two camps for which records do exist appear to have had enrollments of 200 and 400, respectively, in the summer of 1937. Using these figures, and assuming an average enrollment of 300 children in a maximum of 24 camps, yields a figure of about 7,200 children nationwide who may have been in Boone camps each summer of their existence. This number would fit well with a total Boone membership of about 4 times that figure. The most promising young people from the camps were occasionally sent to Germany to continue their training in the Hitler Youth. Regardless of how many children were actually enrolled in the Boone's camps, it was understandably worrying for many Americans to have an organization modeled on the Hitler Youth, drilling children to goose-step and to salute Hitler. The ideology of the camps themselves was not the strangest outcome of the Boone's activities on this front, however. Since housing hundreds of children for the summer required extensive facilities, Kuhn and his lieutenants created a series of puppet corporations that ostensibly owned the campgrounds and were responsible for the construction and maintenance of facilities. Kuhn himself was often the titular head of these corporations. The most famous of these legal fictions was called the German-American Settlement League and was formed to develop a facility called Camp Siegfried in Yanfeng, Long Island. Joining the league required an applicant to be a member of the Bund, ensuring that all members had met Kuhn's rigid racial requirements. Unlike most of the other entities that owned the Boone camps, however, the League was a membership corporation rather than a business, meaning that its 200 or so members were effectively its owners. Because Siegfried was the closest facility for New York City Boone members, it developed into a showpiece that hosted major events and rallies. The camp soon included a small community of homes and other facilities. Adolf Hitler Street was a major thoroughfare, and other streets were similarly named for Nazi bigwigs. Guests from Germany were frequently hosted at Siegfried, and during the summer the OD trained there with rifles and other firearms. Promising members of the youth division from all over the country were also sent to Siegfried to further their education and training, making it effectively the center of Boone training operations nationwide. Major celebrations, such as the 4th of July celebrations that began this chapter, could attract tens of thousands of people from New York City to Siegfried's leafy surroundings. By mid-1936, Kuhn had established the basic structures of the Bund and solidified his own power at the top of the pyramid. The only thing missing, the official endorsement of the German government, was obviously in question given the difficulties of its predecessor groups. Kuhn's solution was clever. The Olympic Games were heading to Berlin in 1936, and Hitler would be making a large number of appearances with foreign delegations and other VIPs as part of the festivities. With the world's press focused on the Reich and the Nazis eager to make a good impression on the international stage, it would be difficult for Hitler to refuse a meeting with a delegation of enthusiastic overseas Germans like the Bund. The gambit paid off. Hitler agreed to meet with a Bund delegation and accepted a book listing the names of Bund members who had contributed to the German Winter Relief Program, a poverty relief charity the government was promoting as an easy way for Germans abroad to help the fatherland. Hitler shook hands with each of the Bund members present for the meeting and uttered a bromide to Kuhn along the lines of, "Go back and carry on your fight." Kuhn returned to the United States with the apparent endorsement of the Fuhrer and photographs documenting their meeting. In reality, Hitler had given him no such approval and had only minimal interest in the Bund. Even the fact that Hitler had met the Bund members meant almost nothing. He had many such meetings, particularly during the Olympics, and they generally progressed in the same way with the usual line of handshakes, photographs, and some vaguely supportive remarks being uttered by Hitler before he was shuttled away to his next engagement. In some cases, Hitler was apparently unaware of whom he was actually meeting until an aide whispered to him each person's name as the handshaking began. In Kuhn's instance, he was probably aware of his guest's identity, but it was hardly a striking endorsement for the Fuhrer to effectively tell him to keep up the good work. Kuhn was aware that Hitler's reception was less than a glowing endorsement. This fact did not dissuade him from trying to capitalize on it, however. He began to exaggerate the trip in speeches, describing personal meetings with grandees including Hermann Göring and propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. The German embassy in Washington began receiving questions from American politicians and the press, about the depths of Kuhn's connection to the Reich government, but had no idea how to answer. Berlin quickly assured its diplomats that Kuhn was simply lying and that the Bund had no real link to the Nazi Party. Regardless, Kuhn had secured the domestic propaganda coup he saw. Accounts and photographs of the meeting were widely reproduced in Bund propaganda, and it seemed fully plausible that Kuhn had received the Führer's endorsement to set up an American version of the Nazi Party. This perception would ultimately be part of the Bund's downfall, but for now it suited Kuhn to be seen as Hitler's closest American friend. He quickly put his plan into overdrive. In October 1936, Kuhn issued a Bund command endorsing Republican candidate Alf Landon for president over Franklin Roosevelt because of the latter's preference for the Jewish element and his placing of many Jews in public office. Landon, on the other hand, was desirable because it can absolutely be assumed that under his administration more favorable commercial relations with Germany would be affected. For if we want to help Germany, there is no better way than in an economic way. The following day, Kuhn issued a proclamation accepting German citizens into a branch of the Bund. This directly contravened the guidelines established by the German embassy towards friends of the new Germany. Now the Bund would contain both American citizens and German nationals. In 1937, Kuhn established new uniform guidelines for the OD. Black long trousers without cuffs, black shoes, steel gray shirt with breast pockets, and a long black tie, shark gray uniform jacket, the present armband, black cap with the Bund insignia, black belt with shoulder straps, and standards for public speaking. The German-American Bund is an organization and has no official connection with Germany and receives no monies. President Roosevelt is not to be attacked personally in any speech. As was standard, most of these proclamations ended with a rousing Sieg Heil. Kuhn had rapidly solidified his power and now intends to turn the Bund into a well-functioning and disciplined organization. Alongside the German-American Bund, Hart also examines the pro-Nazi and anti-interventionist contributions made by influential and explicitly anti-Semitic Christian nationalist figures and organizations, like the Silver Legion, Detroit priest Father Charles E. Collin, Kansas minister Gerald B. Winrod, veteran political organizer Gerald L. K. Smith, as well as politicians such as Senators Ernest Lundeen of Minnesota, Burton K. Wheeler of Montana, and Rush Holt of West Virginia. To make matters worse, Hart explains in his book that Hitler's American friends also included the financial backing of very wealthy business owners, like Alabama-born oil speculator William Rhodes Davis, General Motors' Alfred P. Sloan, and most infamously of all, Henry Ford. In the concluding chapters of his introduction, Hart summarizes, collectively, these sections provide a wide-ranging view of the pro-Nazi movement in the pre-war United States. Some aspects had been built and sponsored by the German government, while others, such as the German-American Bund, were actually seen as unhelpful by the Reich's leaders. However, whether Hitler would have embraced their friendship or not, they all purported to be his friends and represented themselves as such in the public's eye. The darkest underbellies of American society were at the heart of all this. Anti-Semitism, religious bigotry, and greed were the fundamental forces that drew these groups together. With the American economy in dire straits, businessmen fearing the potential rise of communism, and disenfranchised voters looking for a political solution to their woes, the climate was potentially ripe for the rise of fascism. The culminating moment for Hitler's American friends came in the 1940-1941 period, when anti-intervention sentiment reached its peak, simultaneously with the power of the far right. Bund members marched through American streets giving Nazi salutes. Silver shirts armed themselves in preparation for war. Father Collin's brown shirts beat up Jews. Senators made wild allegations about the president becoming a dictator. Nazi agents tried to convince American businessmen to oppose and defeat Roosevelt. It seemed and appeared that everything was in play, and potentially everything was at stake. According to Simcha Weinstein's book Up Up and Oy Vey, How Jewish History, Culture, and Values Shaped the Comic Book Superhero, Jacob Kurtzberg grew up in poverty and dreamed of being an artist, but was forced to drop out of Brooklyn's Pratt Institute after only one day because of financial hardship. Instead, Kirby worked on newspaper comic strips under Gentile-sounding pseudonyms, such as Jack Curtis, Kurt Davis, and Lance Kirby, until he finally settled on the name Jack Kirby. He would eventually work for Timely Comics, the Golden Age precursor to Marvel Comics, and where the mostly Jewish staff openly despised Hitler. He would be paired with fellow Jewish creator Joe Simon, and together they would create Captain America, officially debuting the character to the public 9 months before the bombing of Pearl Harbor in March of 1941, with Captain America Comics #1. The front cover showed its titular hero punching Hitler straight in the face, and with that single unforgettable image, the Nazi idea of the Aryan Ubermensch was subverted. The character was an instant hit, selling almost 1 million copies per issue. Captain America #1 introduces the superhero's alter ego, Steve Rogers. A sickly Depression-era child, Rogers loses his parents at a young age, then tries to enlist in the military. Too feeble to join the regular forces, Rogers volunteers for a top-secret military medical experiment known as Operation Rebirth, headed by Dr. Weinstein. The doctor injects Rogers with super soldier serum. Unfortunately, a Nazi spy infiltrates the experiment and kills Dr. Weinstein, leaving Rogers as the serum's sole beneficiary. Hailed by the U.S. military as a superhuman savior, Rogers dons a patriotic costume of red, white, and blue with a star on the chest and stripes at the waist. As Captain America, Rogers' most important early assignment is to destroy his evil counterpart, a Nazi agent called the Red Skull. In the original comic, the Red Skull was a traitorous aviation magnate. However, in the 1960s, Kirby and Jewish writer Stan Lee created a background story for the villain. In this revisionist tale, the Red Skull begins life as an orphan, Johann Schmidt, who is adopted by a kindly old Jewish shopkeeper and his daughter. In an unprovoked act, Schmidt murders the young woman, then blames his adopted family for his failings. After Hitler takes him under his wing, Schmidt is transformed into the Red Skull, the comic book personification of Nazi atrocities. Comic book adventures offered a fantastic alternative to ghetto life on the overcrowded Lower East Side, where run-down tenement buildings faced noisy streets teeming with people, animals, and garbage. Brawling was commonplace. Kirby recalled, "Captain America was me, and I was Captain America. I saw him as part of me, and he always will be." In the fight scenes, when Cap used to take on 7 men at once, and 5 bodies would fly around the room while he punched 2 in the jaw. Rush is how I remember the street fights from my childhood. But Kirby and Simon's creation, Captain America Steve Rogers, looked so Aryan with his blue eyes and blonde hair. Why? By projecting their own desires for assimilation onto their creations, young artists such as Kirby and Simon created an American ideal they saw as authentic. Cartoonist R.C. Harvey commented on a similar situation within the Hollywood studio establishment at the time, which consisted almost entirely of Jewish businessmen. The America they portrayed in their films was the America they dreamed of belonging to, but it was not the actual America. It was, however, so compelling a portrait, so vivid an impersonation, that all moviegoers, all Americans, bought into it. Jewish movie moguls Sam Goldwyn and Louis B. Mayer bankrolled patriotic fare like Yankee Foodle Dandy, changed the names of Jewish actors like Emmanuel Goldenberg into Edward G. Robinson, and made Danny Kaye bleach his hair. Simon and Kirby's frontal assault on Hitler did not go unnoticed by the Nazis. The German-American Boone bombarded Timely Comics with hate mail and death threats. Seeing strange men loitering outside their building on 42nd Street, Timely employees contacted the police. Suddenly, Joe Simon was summoned to the phone, and Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia himself assured Simon, "You boys over there are doing a good job. The city of New York will see that no harm comes to you." On June 7th, 1943, Kirby received a telegram ordering him to report for active duty. Now he would follow his famous alter ego's example and take on the Nazis for real, coming face to face with his own victimized people, whose pain and suffering was worse than anything the imagination of a comic book illustrator could conjure up. This brings us to the Marvel Cinematic Universe's interpretation of the character, officially debuting in 2011's Captain America: The First Avenger. As mentioned earlier, it was directed by Joe Johnston for Marvel Studios' fifth ever film, released right before 2012's The Avengers. The cast included Chris Evans, Sebastian Stan, Haley Atwell, Hugo Weaving, and Tommy Lee Jones. And the score was composed by Alan Silvestri. The film opens in the present day with an ice excavation at the Arctic that results in the discovery of a giant aircraft buried in the ice. Inside the vessel, they come across the frozen circular shield of Captain America. We then cut back to March of 1942 in the setting of Tønsberg, Norway. Hugo Weaving's Johann Schmidt is leading the invasive forces of the fictional Nazi science division, known as Hydra, in search of an artifact known as the Tesseract, which he successfully acquires before ordering his soldiers to massacre the local community. The movie then cuts to New York, where upon unveilment following the clever concealment of reading a newspaper, with a front page headline covering the events of World War II, we finally get to see Chris Evans as the scrawny and sickly Steve Rogers, looking to follow in his parents' footsteps by attempting to enlist in the 107th Division of the U.S. Army. This attempt is unsuccessful on account of being diagnosed with multiple illnesses. Following this rejection, Steve Rogers goes to a movie theater where the program featuring a World War II vignette is disrupted by a heckler. When Steve calls him out on it, the scene immediately cuts to an alleyway where the heckler is being a bully and beating up Steve. Despite lacking a literal fighting chance, Steve doesn't relent, and rather formally debuts his catchphrase of "I can do this all day." The brawl concludes with the introductory interjection of Sebastian Stan as James Buchanan Barnes, or Bucky, on behalf of his best friend Steve. Bucky then confronts Steve about consecutively lying on his enlistment forms, before inviting Steve to a double date at the World Exposition of Tomorrow for Bucky's last night before deploying as a member of the 107th. Once at the expo, we're then introduced to Dominic Cooper as fictional billionaire engineer and inventor Howard Stark, publicly unveiling a working prototype on a flying car. Steve encounters a recruitment office and departs from Bucky and their dates to once again attempt to enlist in the U.S. Army. Steve finds himself introduced to Dr. Abraham Erskine. Erskine reveals he is a German immigrant who now resides in Queens. Erskine then asks Steve if he wants to kill Nazis, to which Rogers replies with one of my favorite lines of the entire movie, if not the entire MCU. "I don't want to kill anyone. I don't like bullies. I don't care where they're from." Satisfied with that answer, Erskine accepts and recruits Steve Rogers into the Super Soldier Serum program, named Project Rebirth. We then cut to a Hydra base where Johann Schmidt is meeting with Nazi Hydra biochemist Armin Zola, portrayed by Toby Jones. Upon experimentation, they successfully begin to weaponize the Tesseract. We then cut to U.S. Army Base Camp Lehigh, where Steve begins his training. Here he learns that the experiment is sponsored by the Strategic Science Reserve. He is also introduced to Agent Margaret Peggy Carter and Colonel Chester Phillips, respectively portrayed by Haley Atwell and Tommy Lee Jones. The former introduces herself by checking a soldier audaciously expressing misogynistic and disrespectful comments with a solid right hook. The latter is entirely skeptical and disapproving of Erskine's recruitment of Rogers. Shown through a montage, Steve Rogers then begins his basic training, where he is constantly sabotaged by bullies among his peers. However, Rogers refuses to give up and vindicates Erskine's faith in him, once through outsmarting his peers in a capture-the-flag type of challenge presented by their commanding sergeant, despite being directly ordered to resume drills, which also impresses Carter. And then again, when Phillips tests the soldiers with a dummy grenade, where they respond by panicking and hiding, but Rogers jumps atop the grenade with the assumption that he will catch most of the shrapnel. Later in the day, Erskine talks to Steve alone. He reveals that he was originally a scientist who was coerced to work under Schmidt and ordered to create a super soldier serum for him. He also mentions how Schmidt had a very literal understanding and fascination with Teutonic myth and occult power such as the Tesseract. Using Schmidt as an example, Erskine also explains how the serum enhances the traits and personality of the user, before segueing into how that is exactly why he personally selected Rogers to receive the serum with an absolute banger of a line performed by Stanley Tucci that you honestly have to experience for yourself. Meanwhile, back at the Hydra base, we see Schmidt visibly concealed in shadow as he is getting his portrait painted with a brush dipped in red. Zola enters to inform him that Erskine has been located in New York. The following day, Agent Carter accompanies Steve to the lab. Here, they get to know each other, where Steve recalls all the locations he got beat up by bullies he stood up to before. And upon her inquiry, he confesses that he's never danced with anyone before, while also suggesting that he's waiting for the right partner. They finally arrive at a hidden underground base underneath what otherwise appears as an inconspicuous antique shop. Also present are Erskine and Stark as scientists overseeing the experiment. Alongside them are various political figures like Colonel Phillips and Senator Brandt attending as spectators. Steve undergoes the experiment where, according to Erskine, he receives a super soldier serum via microinjections into his major muscle groups before he is saturated with Vita rays. The experiment is a success, and Steve Rogers emerges bigger, taller, and buffer. As the scientists begin to congratulate themselves, one of the spectators reveals themselves to be a Hydra spy when he activates an explosive, steals what appears to be the final available vial of the serum, and fatally shoots Erskine. In his final moment, Erskine points to Steve Rogers' heart, reminding him of his speech from the night before. Outraged by grief, Steve abruptly field tests his new powers by relentlessly chasing the spy who attempts to get away using various methods, such as carjacking, holding a child hostage, and operating a Hydra submarine. However, the spy is unsuccessful as Steve ultimately apprehends him, only for the spy to chew on a cyanide pill. Cutting back to Schmidt's Hydra base, he is confronted by Nazi officials who, on behalf of Hitler, demand to see tangible results of Hydra's experiments. Schmidt complies by activating one of his Tesseract-powered weapons for a demonstration on the Nazis themselves, officially severing Hydra as a separate organization via schism through fascist-on-fascist infighting. As an immediate act of self-preservation, Zola declares allegiance to Hydra. Afterwards, we cut to Steve Rogers having his blood drawn as the SSR believes his DNA is their only chance of replicating Erskine's serum. Disappointed with the inability to immediately replicate the serum, Colonel Phillips orders Rogers to be sent to a lab for further experimentation before Senator Brandt interjects, instead offering him an alternate assignment with which he can contribute to the war effort via the media circuit. What follows is a very pastiche montage formally debuting the earliest iteration of the Captain America costume, based on his original appearance in the comics, with the triangular shield in the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a marketing figure for selling war bonds with a live performance that also includes coordinated dancers and an unnecessarily catchy musical number. The montage features him leaving children awestruck by recreating the cover of Captain America Comics #1 by fake punching a Hitler impersonator as part of the performance. He's also shown being filmed for entirely staged black and white movies meant to function as propaganda. Throughout all of this, he's shown to never be fully comfortable with this assignment, later seen sketching a dancing monkey dressed in a Captain America uniform. This montage culminates with a small time jump into the year 1943 as his campaign tours out of the country and onto the front lines in Italy, performing in front of active duty soldiers who, compared to his much younger audiences back home, aren't as receptive to what they perceive as a disingenuous performer who hadn't seen any action up to this point. He is heckled off the stage, and this is where he reflects on his tenure as a performer through his metaphorical self-portrait as a dancing monkey, when he is approached by Agent Carter. They catch up, and Steve confesses to his dissatisfaction with being unpermitted to contribute more. As wounded soldiers are brought in for medical treatment, Peggy reveals that the soldier Steve just performed in front of were the remaining members of the 107th that were neither captured nor killed. When Phillips confirms that Bucky is one of the soldiers unaccounted for, Steve covertly goes behind his back with the assistance of Carter and Stark to rescue his best friend on an unsanctioned mission into heavily fortified enemy lines. Donning his Captain America costume underneath a more traditional 1940s military uniform along with his shield, Steve successfully infiltrates the Hydra base and encounters other prisoners of war based on characters from the comics, like Dum Dum Dugan, Gabe Jones, and James Montgomery Falsworth. As he frees them, he introduces himself as Captain America. He finally reunites with and liberates Bucky, who appears to have been vaguely experimented on by Zola. As they make their escape, they come across Johann Schmidt, and after an introductory battle that heavily damages Steve's shield, Schmidt peeled off the flesh of his face to reveal a reddish burnt face underneath, thus confirming his character being a complete adaptation of the Red Skull. Red Skull and Zola successfully evade capture as Steve, Bucky, and other POWs make their own escape. We then cut back to Camp Lehigh, where Phillips and Carter begrudgingly gear up to move forward with the presumption that Steve Rogers died in his mission, before Rogers returns with Bucky and the other escaped captives. Steve offers to surrender himself for disciplinary action before Phillips insists that it won't be necessary. Bucky permanently cements Steve's earned newfound status as a hero by setting off an ovation among his peers, shouting, "Let's hear it for Captain America." We then cut to Washington, where a ceremony hosted by Senator Brandt is taking place, with the idea being that he is going to bestow a Medal of Valor on Steve Rogers. However, Steve blows him off to instead attend a strategy briefing disclosing locations of Hydra facilities he learned about while freeing Bucky and the other POWs, who agree to fight Hydra alongside Captain America. As they decompress at a bar, Peggy enters to provide Rogers the assignment of testing out equipment by Stark, and while maintaining eye contact, she expresses her anticipation of dancing with the right partner following the conclusion of the war. We then cut to Howard and one of his lab assistants experimenting on Hydra weaponry when they accidentally cause it to explode. The following morning, Steve arrives for his meeting with Stark when he's caught off guard with a kiss by a private smitten with his reputation, right as Peggy walks by to collect Rogers. Stark shows him various kinds of fully functioning and improved shields to replace his damaged one, before Steve settles on a circular one built out of vibranium. When Steve asks Peggy for her input, still upset by Steve's kiss with the other woman, she takes the liberty of testing out the shield by cathartically shooting at him. Upon confirmation of the shield's effectiveness, Steve gives Stark some sketches with ideas for an upgraded uniform. We then cut to a montage of Captain America donned in a uniform upgraded with carbon polymer and based on what he wore on the War Bonds campaign, alongside the liberated POWs now as his comrades, battling the forces of Hydra at the various locations, successfully overtaking them. Key moments include Steve learning to use his shield as a projectile like in the comics, Bucky showing off his sniping skills, and Steve using a compass that also contains a picture of Peggy Carter, as seen by documented war footage viewed by her and Phillips. The montage culminates with Steve and company infiltrating a moving train transporting cargo for Hydra. While they succeed in capturing Zola, their completion of the mission comes at a cost, as Bucky is knocked out of the train, plummeting from a fatally massive height. A now incarcerated Zola is interrogated by Phillips, who confronts him for not taking a cyanide pill like other captured Hydra agents, and then threatens with putting him on Schmidt's radar with a form of communication that has already been compromised by Hydra. Zola complies by revealing that Schmidt plans on using Tesseract-powered aviation to launch a global-scaled massacre. Peggy finds Steve alone at a defunct bar scorched by the war, where Steve reveals that as a byproduct of the experiment, he can't get drunk. Peggy consoles Steve through his grief as they lock back in for one final battle against Hydra. Steve leads the charge by directly striking the entrance to the Red Skull's final stronghold with a weaponized motorcycle modified by Stark. Once inside, he incapacitates as many Hydra agents as possible before being captured and personally brought to Schmidt. Schmidt asks him what made him so special that Erskine would voluntarily give him the serum. Steve drops a couple more bangers by reminding us of his humility with his answer of nothing. I'm just a kid from Brooklyn. And when Schmidt follows with a strike to the face, Steve rebuttals with his catchphrase, "I can do this all day." With Schmidt so focused on Captain America in his custody, Steve's comrades exploit Hydra's vulnerability by successfully infiltrating via zipline. As Peggy and company overtake the Hydra base, Steve gives chase to Schmidt aboard a Hydra bomber equipped with the Tesseract power weaponry, where Captain America has his final battle against the Red Skull. The Tesseract falls out of its container, and when Schmidt retrieves it, the Tesseract opens up a portal that swallows him whole before burning through the plane into the ocean. With the vessel's weaponry already activated, Captain America finds himself with no choice but to fly the plane directly into the Arctic. Steve takes the opportunity to speak to Peggy using radio transmission as they ponder over what it would have been like to finally get to have that first dance while they are forced to accept the finality of this departure. We then see the aftermath of Steve's sacrifice as well as the conclusion to the war itself, with the surviving prisoners of war liberated by Steve making a toast in honor of Captain America, Stark retrieving the Tesseract while continuing his search hoping to find Steve, and Phillips bestowing Steve's file to Peggy as a gift. The scene then transitions to a young boy echoing a pre-serum Steve with a garbage can painted in the likeness of Captain America's shield, playing with his friends, showing how despite Steve's fate, the legacy of Captain America lives on to inspire the generations of tomorrow. We suddenly cut to Steve Rogers waking up in an anachronistically inauthentic 1940s inspired hospital room, with the radio playing a baseball game, when he is greeted by a nurse in a similarly stylized uniform. Steve sees through the facade when the game being aired through the radio was not only archived from 1941, but it was a game that Steve personally attended. He breaks out of the room and escapes the larger facility, only to find himself in modern-day Times Square. He is then approached by an unknown man with an eye patch and trench coat depicted by Samuel L. Jackson, who explained that the 1940s aesthetic was an attempt to gradually ease Steve into the realization and acceptance that because of his super soldier serum, he was able to survive being frozen in the Arctic for almost 70 years. As Steve tries his best to process this massively irreversible paradigm shift, the man with the eye patch asks him if he's going to be okay. Steve politely responds with yes, before he concludes the movie by ultimately allowing himself a moment to be vulnerable and disclosing that he had a date. Like I mentioned earlier, I didn't make an effort to see this movie in theaters. I actually saw it after the Avengers because I felt like I just couldn't be bothered. Hell, when I first saw it, I thought it was boring. While I don't hate the framing device of him being uncovered from the ice, I do think it undermines a lot of the stakes the bulk of the film insists upon the viewer. I wonder if those scenes could have better served this depiction in the Avengers. And so, as to not get ahead of myself, we can talk about why I feel that way when I get to that film. But yeah, the green screen isn't always subtle, and while the montages are fun, the film's overindulgence with them doesn't exactly service its pacing. I will also admit that the benefit of hindsight has deepened my appreciation of this film, in seeing in how it foreshadows Steve Rogers' character arc. Full disclosure, of the original lineup of the live-action Avengers, Chris Evans as Captain America is my favorite. And yes, Captain America the Winter Soldier is a huge part of it. But also, in a more subtle and early, larger character arc kind of way, this movie depicts the genesis of not just the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but of Steve Rogers following what he originally understood as a patriotic impulse of wanting to serve his country to its inevitable conclusion. The choice between either allegiance to bullies in power or service towards one's community. From the moment he makes the effort to lie on his enlistment forms, to ignoring his drill sergeant during the training montage, to disobeying Colonel Phillips and rescuing No 107. He demonstrates adherence to ethical values that extend far beyond automatic compliance to orders directed by institutions useful to bullies. And all of this starts with a working class, Jewish American coded disabled person, self actualizing into not only a subversion of the Nazi Aryan Ubermensch archetype, but also of revisionist US nationalist iconography by championing the oppressed. With that said, I completely disagree with this common perception that he doesn't have an arc in this film. Yes, he's already entering the movie with a strong sense of morality, but before he once again attempts to enlist at the expo, Bucky calls him out for acting on having something to prove. And I can't even lie, as someone with cerebral palsy, that shit is so real. The honest to God Christian truth is that disabled people always have something to prove. And I've really come around to appreciating the way this film depicts the often unfulfilled sense of outrage and restlessness that comes with being a disabled person living among bullies. Even after he's worked hard to keep up with the other soldiers before being selected by Erskine for the serum, the people around him still doubt him, with his only available options either being stuck in a lab or being reduced to a public spectacle. This absolutely extends to his larger character arc in the MCU's Infinity Saga, but in the context of this film, it is resolved with tragic realization. In putting in the work to prove himself as Captain America, Steve Rogers remains unavailable to have that first dance with Peggy, until they lose that chance following Steve's sacrifice. By the end of this film, Steve Rogers is rewarded for his service as Captain America by being out of time. All in all, Captain America the First Avenger is an earnest and unapologetically cheesy action adventure science fantasy period piece with a lot of heart and plenty of courage in showing it. It's also a great prequel to the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. And now for some levity, we're going to wrap up the video with Captain America the First Avengers' world building using Easter eggs and references. So spoiler alert for other Marvel Cinematic Universe movies and shows. The opening scene of the movie shows the discovery of a frozen Captain America, referencing when the character in the comics was reintroduced through a similar retcon of regular publication without compromising the idiosyncratic World War II roots of his origins in Avengers issue number 4 in 1964. The present day time period of the movie is unclear. On one hand, the MCU tie-in comic book miniseries Fury's Big Week depicts the ice excavation occurring in the same week as the events of Iron Man 2, The Incredible Hulk, and the First Thor. And Iron Man 2 is explicitly set a few months after its predecessor, explicitly confirmed to be taking place in its 2008 release year by Vision in Captain America Civil War. On the other hand, however, that dialogue in Civil War, along with the explicit timelines in Avengers Endgame exercising a reliable pattern that all movies, unless explicitly stated otherwise, occur during the year they were released. So all of this to say that it's somewhere between 2008 and 2011 that Steve Rogers was uncovered from the Arctic. The location of Tonsberg, Norway can also be seen in the first Thor movie, when Odin is seen warring against the Frost Giants. Again in Thor Ragnarok is Odin's final resting place, and the future home for the Asgardian refugees, seen in Avengers Endgame. When Schmidt arrives, he pulls up in a modified V16 Roadster with a Hydra logo for a hood ornament. Inside the church is an ancient Nordic monument to Yggdrasil, the world tree of Teutonic myth, containing the Tesseract. Historically, Nazi propaganda often appropriated Teutonic myth, along with other religious and belief systems like supersessionist Christianity. The Marvel Cinematic Universe's depiction of Heimdall, Hogun, and Valkyrie not only debunked the racist rhetoric of the Nazis, but the existence of Asgardians in general, referred to by Red Skull, reiterates the point made in the first Thor movie that within the MCU, the exploits of the Asgardians inspired the legends of Nordic mythology. Most notably, Odin hiding the Tesseract in Tonsberg. Schmidt's comment on how him and the Churchkeeper understand magic and science to be one and the same is explicitly revisited not only in the previously mentioned Thor movies, but also in Doctor Strange, as the titular protagonist struggles to accept the spiritual worldview due to having previously been accustomed to a strictly scientific and rational paradigm. The movie introduces Hydra in the MCU as the fictional science division for the Nazis, but then Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. would retcon them as one iteration of a secret society that's existed for hundreds of years, with the goal of bringing a banished powerful inhuman named Hive back to Earth to be their ruler. As shown in subsequent MCU content such as Avengers Infinity War, the Tesseract will be revealed to be one of the 6 Infinity Stones, specifically the Space Stone. The Tesseract also appears in Captain Marvel, Thor, the Avengers, Avengers Infinity War, and Avengers Endgame. It is also mentioned in relation to the other stones in Guardians of the Galaxy and Avengers Age of Ultron. When Schmidt shoots the church keeper, blood splatters on a pin illustrating the Hydra emblem worn by the former, visually foreshadowing his reveal as the Red Skull. While Steve is waiting for his turn at the recruitment office, the fellow aspiring soldier on his left is reading a paper where the headline references the events of the previous scene in Norway. When Steve is getting beat up in the alley, he foreshadows his future with the iconic shield by trying to use a trash can lid as a weapon. In this same scene, we as the audience are introduced to his catchphrase of, "I can do this all day." He references it again in Captain America Civil War, and once more in Avengers Endgame. Sebastian Stan's Bucky is introduced and goes on to make subsequent appearances in Captain America the Winter Soldier, Captain America Civil War, Avengers Infinity War, and Avengers Endgame, among other movies and shows. When Bucky invites Steve to the expo, the latter asks where they're going, to which the former responds with, "the future," thus cleverly foreshadowing how both characters will end up in the present day. The Expo is a 1940s predecessor to the Stark Expo seen in Iron Man 2, dancers and all. The venue hosting the Expo is named Modern Marvel's Pavilion, a straightforward reference to Marvel Comics. At the Expo, we see an exhibit bearing the name of Phineas Horton, displaying the original Golden Age version of the Human Torch, this one being an android invented by Dr. Horton that moonlighted under the alias Jim Hammond. Not only did the character team up with Captain America in the comics, but prior to this movie, Chris Evans portrayed the Johnny Storm version of the Human Torch in the Fantastic Four movies from the 2000s. In the comics, Jim Hammond ends World War II by killing Hitler. Chronologically speaking, this is the earliest appearance of Howard Stark. It's Dominic Cooper's first time playing the younger version, a role he would return to in the Agent Carter one-shot short film, as well as spin-off TV series of the same name. John Slattery would play an older version of the character in Iron Man 2, Ant-Man, Captain America Civil War, and Avengers Endgame. The prototype for the flying car being presented by Stark gets a callback in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. when Agent Coulson is shown to be in ownership of a fully functioning flying car that he named Lola. Howard's experimentation with flight technology serves as a subtle foreshadowing of his future son's destiny as Iron Man. When Steve and Bucky part ways at the expo, Bucky tells Steve, "Don't do anything stupid until I get back," and Steve sarcastically responds with, "How can I? You're taking all the stupid with you." This line gets called back to in Avengers Endgame, as a more somber repeating of this exchange would be the final on-screen scene between Sebastian Stan and Chris Evans in the MCU's Infinity Saga. When Steve and Erskine first become acquainted, the latter says that he lives in Queens while the former says Brooklyn. Captain America Civil War gives a subtle nod to this moment, as Steve shares the exact same exchange with Tom Holland's Spider-Man, prompting him to smile. Dr. Armin Zola's future appearance as an artificial intelligence communicating via monitor is visually foreshadowed when his face is shown through a magnifying glass. Toby Jones reprises the role in Captain America Winter Soldier and the Agent Carter spin-off series produced by Marvel Television. The site for Project Rebirth is Camp Lehigh, which makes future appearances in Captain America the Winter Soldier and Avengers Endgame. This movie also marks Haley Atwell's beginning with the role of Agent Margaret Peggy Carter. She reprises the role in Captain America the Winter Soldier, Ant-Man, Avengers Endgame, and of course the Agent Carter TV series as well as one-shot short film. The misogynistic soldier played by Lex Shrapnel, attempting to undermine Agent Carter's authority, only to catch a well-deserved right hook, is actually a character from the comics named Gilmore Hodge. This is the same soldier who actively tries to sabotage Steve during the training montage. In demonstrating his self-sacrificing levels of courage by jumping on top of the dummy grenade, Steve foreshadows his fate not only in this movie, but that in Captain America the Winter Soldier, where he'll once more be aboard a global-scale level threat of a Hydra aircraft attributed to Project Insight to ensure it's destroyed. On the car ride to the experiment, Steve and Peggy discuss having their first dance together upon the end of the war. They will of course have to wait until the conclusion of the Infinity Saga to have that dance together in the final scene of Avengers Endgame. The Incredible Hulk shows us that the MCU's adaptation of the titular character's origin story is rooted in General Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross attempting to recreate the super soldier serum, which is also foreshadowed by Erskine's explanation to Steve of how the serum amplifies the character traits and personality of the subject, like Bruce Banner. There are even visual parallels in how both of them suddenly shoot their eyes open upon receiving the serum. Another visual parallel to a fellow MCU movie from Phase 1 is how the death of Erskine is filmed similarly to how Yinsen dies in front of Tony Stark in Iron Man. Considering they're both origin stories for two of the most important characters in the Infinity Saga, a visual emphasis on shared experiences, like the death of a mentor, feels very appropriate. The Hydra spy that kills Erskine foreshadows the reveal in Captain America the Winter Soldier on how the organization successfully infiltrated the US government. When Steve chases the Hydra agent, he runs across the rooftop of cars, which is a method of traversing he'll use again during the Battle of New York in the Avengers. We also see a continuation of his shield's evolution as he uses a car door with a star painted on it to defend himself from gunshots. Steve having his blood drawn is a massive plot point for the larger MCU, and how various parties seek to recreate Erskine's serum. A vial of Steve's blood, in particular, plays an important role in the first season of Agent Carter. David Harbour's Red Guardian also shows that eventually the Russian government was also able to replicate the experiment. Steve's discomfort with being on the media circuit runs in stark contrast to how both Howard and Tony are more attuned towards showmanship. Pun fully intended. Laura Haddock appears as a fan wanting Steve's autograph, and since she would go on to be cast as Peter Quill's mother Meredith in the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, a popular fan theory is that her character here is his grandmother. After his final performance, and while he's being consoled by Peggy, they witness survivors of the 107th being brought in for medical attention. Alan Silvestri introduces a subtle musical motif that gets called back to in Avengers Endgame, where he epically expands on it with a more bombastic interpretation during the portal scene. When Steve learns that Bucky is one of the soldiers unaccounted for, he goes off to rescue his best friend. This movie won't be the last time Steve sets out to save Bucky. He will find himself having to do so again in Captain America the Winter Soldier, Captain America Civil War, and Avengers Endgame through the Time Heist. The prisoners of war from the 107, such as Dum Dum Dugan, Gabe Jones, and Jim Merida, are based on members of the Howling Commandos from the comics. Though their unit is never referred to by this name in the movie, they do get referred to as such in the direct sequel Captain America the Winter Soldier, and again in the spin-off TV series Agent Carter. Descendants of the Howling Commandos appear throughout the present-day entries of the MCU, such as Antoine Triplett in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and Jim Merida's actor Kenneth Choi, portraying his initial character's grandson as Peter Parker's high school principal in Spider-Man Homecoming. In the comics, MCU Howling Commandos character James Falsworth portrays a Captain America adjacent super soldier known as Union Jack. The most crucial moment of Steve and Bucky's escape is when Steve has to jump over a destroyed bridge right as the Hydra base is about to explode. So Alan Silvestri emphasizes Steve's summoning of his courage with another distinct musical motif that we'll also hear again in Avengers Endgame, when he confirms his worthiness by summoning Thor's hammer Mjolnir in their ultimate battle against Thanos. At the Medal of Valor ceremony hosted by Senator Brandt that Steve blows off, we can see a 2-for-1 cameo appearance by Stan Lee alongside actor Reb Brown, the latter of whom portrayed Captain America in films from the 70s. When Steve selects his iconic circular shield, Howard explains that it's made out of a metallic element known as vibranium. I know it's been a while since my last episode, but what we know about vibranium is that after a vibranium meteorite landed in ancient Wakanda, the Wakandans were empowered into making significantly more advanced scientific developments compared to the rest of the world. One of their primary choices of homeland defense is underplaying the full extent of their technological developments from other countries, along with the implementation of their secret network of spies known as the War Dogs. Though, as seen in Eyes of Wakanda, their defense measures aren't perfect, as sometimes enemies and invaders of Wakanda do succeed in forcefully extracting the mineral from the country. Other examples are seen in the opening prologue to the first Black Panther movie, explaining how Ulysses Klaue and Njobu collaborated in successfully smuggling vibranium out of Wakanda. And Klaue can once again be seen selling it in Avengers Age of Ultron. Vibranium in general is a recurring plot device in the Black Panther movies, but it's also referenced in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Captain America the First Avenger never explicitly stated exactly how Stark was able to acquire the mineral, but considering he's operating under the impressions that the shield contains what was left of it, I personally have more questions than answers. Set during Captain America's montage showing him kicking Hydra ass alongside Bucky and the other Howling Commandos is the tie-in comic book miniseries Captain America First Vengeance. The comic follows two plot lines set during two different time periods. One in 1944, set during the previously mentioned montage, being a Howling Commandos mission in their war against Hydra, and the other beginning in 1924, exploring the motivations and backstories of characters like Steve, Bucky, Erskine, Howard, and Schmidt. This comic shows us how Steve's courage, perseverance, and above all, valuing of thoughtfulness over brute strength were instilled in him by his mother. We also see the initial meeting of Steve and Bucky as they team up to fight off a gang of bullies. First Vengeance also shows us how Steve and Bucky were motivated to join the war effort following the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Steve in particular points out how this can segue to also holding accountable the fascist regimes of Hitler and Mussolini. First Vengeance also introduces Johann Schmidt as a university professor majoring in physics, whose research earns the approval of real-life historical Nazi figures Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler. He also first meets Armin Zola when the latter is the sole survivor of subordinates serving under one of Schmidt's political opponents within the Nazi regime. First Vengeance also not only shows us that Erskine had a family, but that Schmidt coerced him to make the original super soldier serum by literally holding him against his will and threatening to murder his family. As disclosed in Erskine's speech to Steve in the movie, the experiment succeeds in empowering Schmidt with super strength while also physically disfiguring him into the Red Skull. Howard Stark is brought into the war when Hydra agents attempt to assassinate him. Finally, First Vengeance introduces Agent Carter as having infiltrated Hydra as a double agent with the mission of rescuing Erskine. Tragically, she also discloses to Erskine how his family died in a concentration camp, and Schmidt purposely withheld this information so as to continue exploiting Erskine. Also set during Captain America's montage in 1944 is the tie-in video game Captain America Super Soldier. I wish I could say that I've played it. The versions for the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 in particular look like a lot of fun. But unfortunately, I don't currently own either console, so I had to settle for cutscene compilations on YouTube. I'd like to particularly shout out the channel Gamer's Little Playground for their video on this game. World building wise though, there are some interesting things going on in both tie-ins worth giving attention. To begin, we have what appears to be a proposed continuity between the Iron Man armor and weaponized suits of armor built for Hydra by Zola, resembling the larger builds seen in the first Iron Man movie, like the Mark I armor or Obadiah Stane's Ironmonger armor. The game's adaptation of Captain America villain Iron Cross is a notable example. Perhaps following the end of the war, Howard got a hold of these designs, and maybe Tony would grow up to see them at some point before the events of his first film. Perhaps these are the scientific inspirations appropriated by Tony Stark to use in helping Captain America battle the returning forces of Hydra in the present day. Something else that's interesting is how in this game, the Howling Commandos instead go by the name of the Invaders. In the comics, the Invaders are another World War II era group that Captain America was a part of alongside Namor the Submariner and the previously mentioned Jim Hammond version of the Human Torch. We also have what looks to be an introduction to the MCU's version of Captain America villain Baron Wolfgang von Strucker. Officially speaking, the character's live-action introduction in Avengers Age of Ultron should be enough to make this game non-canon. But if there's room for a headcanon of Peter Quill's grandmother, then who's to say that the present-day version, portrayed by Thomas Kretschmann, isn't the son of the version seen here? Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. shows us that version having a son along with its strange relationship. Perhaps it runs deeper in the family than we're initially led to believe? Perhaps their similarities in appearances are a byproduct of an abusive upbringing. Another interesting development is the introduction of fellow Captain America villain Madame Hydra. Here she is depicted as a lieutenant under Johann Schmidt, who assists a returning Zola in his experiments. In Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., the artificial intelligence Ada constructs her double life within the simulated alternate history world of the Framework, where Hydra won World War II as the modern-day director of Hydra under the name Ophelia, which is the character's name from the comics that is the source of inspiration for the version seen in this game. Perhaps she was also the source of inspiration for Ada in the Framework. Now, on the surface, this game's canonicity to the Marvel Cinematic Universe has aged dubiously at best, and my insistence on a 15-year-old video game I've personally never owned or even played being canon is reinforced entirely by headcanon. But so is the young boy in the Iron Man mask in Iron Man 2 being a young pre-Tom Holland Peter Parker until the actor himself confirmed it, because why the fuck not? Anyways, these are just theories. Zillennial Falcon theories. Wrapping up our overview of the tie-in video game, the boss battle against the giant robots operated by Dr. Armin Zola foreshadows his fate as artificial intelligence in Captain America the Winter Soldier. James Falworth in this game is once again held captive by Zola, but as a would-be subject for their latest attempt at recreating the super soldier serum. Zola's experimentation with a member of the Howling Commandos, intending to brainwash him into a personal assassin against Captain America, once again foreshadows the Winter Soldier, seeing as this is exactly what happens to Bucky. It also alludes to the comic book background of the character as Union Jack. Zola is revealed to have been remotely operating the robots before making his escape with Red Skull in time for the end of the montage in the second half of the movie. Within the actual montage in the movie itself can be seen the introduction of Steve's compass with Peggy's picture. He reflects on it once again during the beginning of Avengers Endgame. Bucky's death is another reference to Avengers number 4, since this was the retcon Marvel Comics used to show how Steve and Bucky had their apparent deaths in a plane crash during a World War II mission, where the former would be frozen in ice until the 60s, and the latter would return as the Winter Soldier in the mid-2000s. When Red Skull picks up the Tesseract outside of its container, a blue portal opens up and swallows him. This not only foreshadows the reveal of the Tesseract being the Space Stone of the 6 Infinity Stones seen throughout the Marvel Cinematic Universe and its Infinity Saga, but also the Red Skull's return as the Keeper of the Soul Stone in Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. Steve's file given to Peggy can be seen again in her titular spin-off, Agent Carter, set 1 year after the defeat of Red Skull and the apparent self-sacrifice of Captain America. For the final scene, the movie reconverges back to its initial reference to Avengers number 4 in the opening scene, showing a now unfrozen Steve Rogers waking up in the present day, where he will go on to assemble and lead the Avengers. While never explicitly named in this movie, there's zero doubt about Samuel L. Jackson portraying Nick Fury, who also appears in Iron Man 2, Captain America the Winter Soldier, and all 4 Avengers movies of the Infinity Saga. The post-credit scene for this movie is pretty gosh, honestly. It's literally just a trailer for the Avengers, but considering this was the last Marvel movie released before it, the logic behind the marketing isn't lost on me. I just want to wrap up this video by thanking you guys so much for your patience and for staying tuned in. I know that it's going to be 6 months since I've dropped my previous video, and this video took a lot longer to make than I thought or hoped it would. Like I've previously mentioned, I'm learning in real time how to make content, and I'm sure I still have plenty to learn. So yeah, thank you guys again for tuning in. I was hoping to get this video out in time for Spider-Man Brand New Day. That's why I made the joke about the cosmetic similarities between Spider-Man and Captain America. But anyways, this is the Zillennial Falcon, and I'll be signing off until next time. Hopefully sooner than later.